Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Half Pint session. So, C.S. Lewis was very well known for reading old books. He's actually got an entire essay. It was used as a preface to Sister Penelope's translation of St. Athanasius's On the Incarnation. And Lewis's essay is entitled On the Reading of Old Books. And Lewis had a rule that he said, after reading a new book, something that had been recently written, he said, never allow yourself another one till you've read an old one in between. And I have joining me today a man who I'm pretty sure holds this with the best record of anybody I've met up until now. D.P. Curtin, welcome to the show.
It's great to be here, David.
Well, would you mind just introducing yourself to our viewers and explain why you managed to read so many old books?
Oh, I read quite a few old books at this point. Not just, this is an actual bookshelf. My world is populated with books. I'm fairly certain they're keeping the roof over my head right now. So, yes, I am D.P. Curtin. I usually go that with my moniker. My first name is Dermot.
Mm-hmm.
I am aggressively Irish, but on this side of the pond, most people get confused by that. So I just make it a little easier on people.
Well, I mean, it also sounds classy, C.S. Lewis, D.P. Curtin. There's a reason for it. One of my very good friends back in England was called Dermot, and the name literally means without envy.
That's right. Yeah.
And I didn't feel that when I discovered quite how many languages you can read and write and speak.
Sometimes not with the fluency that I would like. So as a child, my father wanted to very much instill the Irishness. He would come home and try to greet us in broken Gaelic. Trying to learn the Irish language a little bit better as an adult, you find out exactly how fragmentary it was. But there is something about knowing a language, the diction that's used, kind of the flavor of the words and the phraseology. And even with Irish, it's very familiar. It's very religious. There's no way of just being able to say hello. You have to say, Digrit. And the answer respond to that, Jesus be with you. You respond with Digagus Shmorgrit. Jesus and Mary also greet you. There's no way of really being able to secularize a language like that.
Sure. So what's your background? I've alluded to the fact that you're something of a linguist and a philologist, but what's been your career?
My career? Well, my career has certainly been an interesting one. My primary source of income is working as a psychologist. So I work in the mental health system. This is actually my office right here in Newark, Delaware. Most of my classical training, especially with Latin and ancient Greek, come from my undergraduate time at Villanova. I was there for a little while as a graduate student. Especially early on, I think a lot of Latinists in particular have had the struggle of finding work. So, like, the public school system has disavowed themselves of Latin altogether. Mm-hmm. Some classical schools still have it a little bit, but they're few and far between. And even most Catholic schools, like when I was in Catholic high school, my Latin class was 4 people out of 1,200. So it's not a craft that's kind of still within the mainstream.
Mm-hmm. I did Latin in school between the ages of 11 and 13, and I didn't enjoy it. I wasn't quite ready for that style of language with all of the cases. I was much more at home inside French, but so I begged to be let out of the class, and they told me that I was allowed to quit the class if I got less than 60% on my end of term exam. And I remember sitting there in the final few minutes, totting up what I thought I got just to make sure that I didn't go over the 60%. And I think I got something like 58%. So they allowed me to drop it, which made me very happy at the time. But with my son going to a classical Christian school in the next few years, I picked up Duolingo and I completed their Latin course. So I don't feel quite so unprepared for when my son begins greeting me with salve. But that then brings us to your great translation project, which is the Scriptorium Project.
Yes.
What is it? Where did this come from? What are you doing?
So the Scriptorium Project is an attempt to catalog, translate, and distribute some of the great works of Western civilization that have really hitherto been neglected. So if you were a university student in the year 1900, somewhere in the Western world, the expectation is that you would know Latin with a high degree of fluency. All of your textbooks are largely going to be heavily Latin. The nature of the library is a collection of the humanities of works in Latin. Latin, despite its medieval association, is still very much the language of law and the language of science. The challenge in the growing, we'll call them mores of the university system, is that the classics have just been kind of thrown away. So now we have this vast library, books upon books, that have been really untouched for the better part of a century. So the immense wisdom, the historical knowledge, the base that really is the medieval world is more or less just being neglected right now. Because English is more or less the lingua franca of the world that we live in, trying to be able to take these texts and put them in a accessible vernacular English is really the basis of the Scriptorium Project, which at this point has several hundred books to its name, ranging from about the year 400 to the collapse of Constantinople, so for about 1,000 years, trying to be able to make them not only accessible by language, but also the phraseology of certain books. Certain Catholic writers are famous and are known as great polymaths, but to be blunt, they're terrible writers. The medieval era is really the golden age of the run-on sentence. But trying to, and it makes sense, punctuation is still in an embryonic form at that point. But it is very challenging, even if you remove the language barrier there.
Mm. So I discovered the early church fathers, so those who succeeded the apostles, very often bishops and priests, sometimes catechists and apologists. I discovered them in my early 20s, and I was fortunate enough to be introduced to the first few through really good translations that I could actually read.
Yes.
And I really ended up loving this particular series, if you can see it. It's the
That's an excellent
ancient
series.
Christian writers. Really liked these. But I very quickly stumbled into other areas that weren't, well, I'm not going to say weren't as well translated. The translations were much older. So you had a lot of the church fathers like Tertullian, where I'm sure it was difficult in Latin, but honestly, it wasn't that much easier in English.
So there was a lot of significant movement in the late 19th century to translate a lot of the ante-Nicene fathers. They are currently cataloged. A lot of their works are available for free online. So those really fundamental elements of the church fathers, Origen, Tertullian, Augustine, Ambrose, in my opinion, we have those fairly well covered. But for whatever reason, roughly around the year 400, whoever was leading this translation of them decided that that wasn't important anymore. And so there's just this large body of texts, names that are familiar to us. I mean, they're the names that kind of grace churches and places in England. Certainly will have places that are homages to these people. But that's really all that's left. Going back and really being able to understand who these people were. In particular, I have a small stack of books here. St. Albert the Great, whose name is instantaneously recognizable, mostly as the teacher of St. Thomas Aquinas. But his works have been almost entirely neglected for the last 800 years, even by Latinists. So I have one book here on fate, which is his attempt to try to be able to understand some of the questions that are associated with destiny, the philosophical underpinning that really comes with the human experience here. And he writes in a very distinctive way. At the time in the universities, there's really only three disciplines. There's theology, law, and medicine. And sometimes those get very easily blurred for people working in the system. So he'll talk certain points about physiology, about the functions of the humors, and a lot of Galenic medicine, which you don't normally associate with theology of the period. But it really represents a tremendous snapshot of the medieval world that he's living in that you wouldn't be able to get through a text about him or a blurb about him. Here are the words of the saint himself spelled out in black and white, ipse dixit.
What manuscripts are you using when you're doing these translations? So you said they've been mostly neglected, but somebody must have kept onto them, taken pictures of them, have them in an archive somewhere.
So trying to be able to transcribe from the original handwritten Latin would be an exercise in futility. You really need a lot of patience to be able to do that based upon the variance in scribal handwriting. So the easiest way for me to have access to this, when it comes to Latin texts, I like to use the Patrologia Latina, which, if you're unfamiliar with it, in the middle of the 19th century, there was a Jesuit who had compiled all of these works from the Western Church Fathers writing in Latin and put them into a single facsimile. Everything is typed up very nicely. It's just that it's left there. It's in Latin, and nobody's touched these works since that time. So he's probably the single largest repository for some of these documents. And if you go to most seminaries, they have a full collection of that on their wall somewhere. It's usually not in great shape. And they have a similar one for the Greek fathers and the Syriac fathers. They don't spend as much time with them. And those texts are a little bit more complicated because we can't guarantee the provenance and the veracity of them. So I'm a little bit more cautious with Migne's work when it comes to the Eastern Church. But for the Latin Church, there really isn't any better source.
How is all of this funded? Is this just you? You know, you sign out from your day job and then you pull up this facsimile or a medieval manuscript and you just get to work?
Funded. I'd like to say that there's some like massive endowment, but no, there's nothing like that. This is not something that exists in the space where it has affiliation. So I didn't want any kind of ecclesiastical affiliation. A lot of the works that we deal with are works that are of a disputed nature between the Catholic and the Orthodox world. So saying that we're a distinctively Catholic organization would scare some people off, so they wouldn't read the text. So trying to maintain some level of neutrality. In terms of funding, everything is self-perpetuating. So as books continue to be translated and sales continue to rise, we can put more money out there for things that are a little bit more inaccessible. Trying to be able to make more things accessible is really the financial challenge. So there's a lot of body of work of the early church that's in Syriac, so there's Biblical Aramaic, that I have no remote knowledge of. We have the texts for them, but trying to be able to find translators to be able to work in that medium is very difficult. So in terms of funding, the sale of these kinds of books go out and are ultimately snowballing into more and more works as things continue to evolve.
Wow. Is there a plan? Do you have a roadmap of, what you're going to be doing for the rest of your life? Because at least for this podcast, I pretty much have all of the seasons planned out until my estimated death at the age of 90, just to make sure I get through all of Lewis's work. Now, you have a much bigger project. So how are you approaching this?
I mean, effectively, there can't be an endpoint because the scope of it is vast. I think if I really dedicated myself every day to it, I just nonstop translation, I would still just be chipping away at the smallest little chunk. I don't know if you know the metaphor from James Joyce in The Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man, where the old priest is describing time, and he says, imagine the ball the size of the earth and an ant that's marching around it at its equator. In the time that it takes that ant to carve a niche that's an inch deep, that's the first second and the first minute and the first hour of eternity. That image actually is what I think of a lot of when I'm working on these. There's so much that can be done, so much that probably should be done that nobody else is really doing. And effectively, the task seems increasingly infinite because as there's facsimiles that we have that survive from the 17th and 18th and 19th century, there are also works that have never been transcribed and works that are they're cataloged. We know they exist, but they require a special, let's call it road trip to be able to access them. Certainly, famously, the Vatican archives are this massive collection of documents, which they're still sorting out from Napoleon's intervention 2 centuries ago. that gives you the literary task at hand. It's effectively impossible to achieve in one lifetime.
It kind of reminds me when I first fell in love with the church fathers, and I started thinking about setting myself a goal. It's like, all right, I'm going to read everything from the apostolic fathers. Like, that's maybe doable. Then I thought, oh, no, I'm really enjoying Augustine. I'm going to try and read everything Augustine wrote. And that was like, no, that's just definitely not happening. I don't know how he managed to write all of this, let alone me read it all in a lifetime. But as a non-academic, why is there this massive backlog? Why are there so many texts that haven't been translated? Isn't this what academics do? Isn't this what people spend their PhDs doing?
Well, this is true. There's a lot of potential opportunity here. Some of it is the shift in the university system. The humanities are no longer a priority. Mm-hmm. The demise, especially here regionally in the Atlantic Northeast, of English departments, of classics departments, of history departments, something that's only getting worse as the years continue to pass by. There are certainly graduate students who are tremendously interested and dedicated to the task, but the task is too large to be achieved independently. And the universities, their interest is elsewhere, especially like large research institutes. They're very much interested in things that will be able to continue, things like grant money and the perpetuation of programs. For them, an 800-year-old book by some medievalist is a low priority, to say the least. So it really falls upon the world of independent research to be able to do that. The challenge is, as you mentioned, being able to finance it. So I can invest my time putting hours into a text, and maybe it'll sell 2 copies. That's not really financially viable for most people. The intention of this project is to go after those texts that are distinctively not financially viable to the publishing industry, which is a terrible business model.
I was going to say that's a terrible business plan, but very laudable nonetheless.
Yeah.
I mentioned at the beginning on the reading of old books by Lewis, and he says that every age has its own outlook, and he sees that you see in each of them they're liable to see certain truths and to make certain mistakes, and this is why we need to read old books. He says that the only palliative is to keep he calls it the clean sea breeze of the centuries blowing through our minds, and that's why this matters.
There's a certain sense of, you can see the recurrence of, I'm a psychologist, so I use this phrase very cautiously, but of human nature that you see play out. There's this element of hubris that seems to cut across every generation, that we've achieved the apex of human civilization and there's nothing more that can be known. We can just stop here. You see that even in the medieval period, certainly in the high medieval period, where there's the rediscovery of Aristotle and the rebirth of medicine, and they just assume like this is it, this is the pinnacle of it. And like we see that same hubris today. It's just, you wouldn't know it unless you actually went back to these contemporary texts and saw it.
Lewis's friend Owen Barfield, together they use the phrase chronological snobbery, the idea that everyone before us kind of morons, but we got it now. We've definitely got it now. No mistakes anymore.
Yeah.
Well, what are some of your favorite things that you've translated?
Favorite things? Honestly, some of the things that are the more esoteric, the better.
Said like a true academic.
Yeah. Well, like things that are overtly familiar. And like I say this as someone who's thoroughly versed in the world of Latin, but things outside of the Latin sphere are really interesting to me. As a child going to parochial Catholic school, there were certain talks of legends. St. Thomas was said to have gone to India. If you read the church fathers, all of them talk about it. Jerome talks about it, Ambrose talks about it, Basil talks about it, but nobody says anything else about it. It's just Thomas went to India. It's just kind of assumed on the fact of that. But if you go to southern India, there's actually an entirely separate tradition that goes into detail regarding Thomas's journey there, the churches he planted, and his eventual martyrdom on Mount Chennai in southern India. So I didn't do the translation of that work myself. I did the commentary based upon it and the introduction, with every reference that we can potentially find in the patristic period to what exactly was taking place with this legend about Thomas going to India. So That came out in 2020, I want to say. The Ramen Patu, the song
It's a
of,
song, yeah.
yeah. Ramban is related to the Syriac word for rabbi, it's for teacher, which they also use in southern India to mean a deacon. But they didn't write it down. They sung it. They sung it for 16 centuries to be able to keep the memory of it alive in the same way that you see the Homeric poet, who is usually associated with Homer himself. The original transposition of the Iliad and the Odyssey was as a verse, as a poem that would be spoken and given to the community. This song about St. Thomas is just the same. Trying to be able to parse it apart and be able to expose it to a Western audience that's totally unfamiliar with it. It's probably been the highlight of my work with the Scriptorium Project in general.
Mm. And it does speak to something of the rich tapestry of church history. That this is the thing that I always find when I dip into a new area that I've never seen before. I discover a new world that I basically never knew existed.
Yeah, and the experience of the church is so vast. To talk of its Catholicness, this is the truest sense of it. Its universality exists on so many levels because when the church enters into a new culture, the message remains the same, but the expression of it changes. So when when it comes to Ireland, you have these strange beehive monasteries on the coast and monks with half of their head shaved in a very distinctive style. That's distinctively Celtic, the Celtic expression of Christianity. Not just the same you see it taking place in Germany and in Greece, and when it arrives in Russia or in southern India, or the strange places that we don't usually talk about, like Sudan, which had a very strong Nubian church well into the High Middle Ages.
You mentioned there the Celtic Church. Have you translated any works from that region and era?
Yes, the challenge with the Celtic Church is the question of antiquity. So there's a lot of vitae, lives of saints,
Mm-hmm.
and they're very interesting, but they're clearly from a later period where these lives have been worked out. So some of the later lives of St. Patrick or St. Finbar of Cork, who are significant figures in the Irish church, but the hagiography that has developed over the centuries has clearly been inserted into them. So by the time you get to their composition in the 12th and 13th century, there's a little bit, it's kind of the shaggy dog quality that kind of comes with some of these stories. But nonetheless, they remain significant features. Just with the Irish church in particular, there's so many documents that were clearly there that have been lost. Lost by neglect, lost by the wars of religion in the 16th century. And that's the crime in all of this. Once a book is lost, there's no recovering it. That's just a page of history that's forever forgotten.
That's always the saddest reading I ever do when I see, particularly when there's a focus on somebody in the early church, like when Eusebius is writing his history and he comes to a figure and he lists all of their works. And I go, oh, cool. I look it up. And it's like, we have about 2 of these left.
Yeah.
The rest of them lost.
So the early church father Papias of Hierapolis, who's writing as a contemporary to, let's say, the Gospel of John, allegedly has this tremendous commentary that would have been fantastic had it survived. But in the analog world where you just have books on library shelves, you don't know where things is, and just random things are copied, it's easy to lose track of things. And that ultimately has been the fate of so many books. St. Augustine talks about his conversion because of, I think it was Cicero's book Hortensius, which he talks about and quotes from extensively, but we don't have a single page of it. Clearly, it was an influential work in the classical world, but it's just gone.
Yeah. Well, Lewis loved the medieval writers. As someone that's looked at those works, how would you describe them in general if you wanted to paint with a broad brush?
Medieval writers in general. So that has to be a very broad brush. There's certainly something different. So the high writers of the classical world, names that most people are familiar with, like Ovid and Horace and Virgil, they're certainly very technically skilled in the language itself as grammarians. There is a lack of general fantasy that seems to come along with that. I would not describe most of the great classical Latin writers as being one for a lot of fantasy, with the exception of maybe Catullus, but he is absolutely filthy. He's very much the 16-year-old boy of Latin poets. But to your question about like the broad brush of the medieval world, the medieval world is occupying this very different space. There is very much a sense of ambiguity, especially before the rediscovery of Aristotle and the university systems were more firmly established. At that point, by about 1200, things are starting to shift in a different direction. But there's this tremendous sense of mystery, of wonder that kind of underlies all things. Whereas this drive to be able to understand the world for whatever it is. And anything is accessible. So I mentioned St. Albert the Great, who confuses, I don't know if confuses, he mixes together the philosophy and medicine of his time period to try to be able to understand the world. In contrast, especially to the modernist author, like it would be very strange for you to read a medical journal that suddenly started talking about Aristotle, unless it was in some kind of historical sense. But that's very much the mindset that there really is no separation between knowledge, that all of these things ultimately have to be drawn together. Mm-hmm. And there's this tremendous thirst for information, especially and this is something so antithetical to our own age, where information is at our fingertips. We can find anything that we would like instantaneously. For the medieval mindset, if you wanted to know something, first and foremost, you needed to be literate. Secondly, you needed to go to a place that would be a repository for that information, like a monastery. And finally, that book had to exist there on the monastery and you had to find it. That multi-step process means that knowledge is pretty important and pretty limited. So what goes around is a lot of mix of classical information, sometimes with random hearsay. So if you read some of the histories of the period, especially the British histories, they're fairly famous for this. There's all kinds of euhemerisms and myths and legends that are mixed together in the story of the foundation of England, famously in persons like King Arthur. But this also comes into play in some of the ethnogenesis stories that exist, and even people like St. Gregory of Tours.
A lot of what you're saying makes sense of what we see in Lewis, who saw himself as a synthesizer of information, a transposer of trying to distill what he had learnt from the classical world and the medieval world and speak to modern man. Dr. Jason Baxter describes him as a modern day Boethius, a British Boethius, trying to take this vast amount of information and pass it down the line, so to speak, to the current generation.
The analogy there with Boethius is very striking. So Boethius is a man who's living at the very twilight of the classical world, is trying to be able to take that information. And I don't think it's ever a good sign in civilization where you can point to a single guy in the century and say, that guy is the smartest guy around. But Boethius, it's not the sign of a healthy civilization, but it's very apparent in the time of Boethius. The accruement of that kind of knowledge is very difficult in the time that he's writing. But there has to be some level of how do you take ancient wisdom and effectively transmit it to a new generation.
So let's talk languages. Which ones do you know? And you don't have to give me I could buy a paper in this, just broadly speaking. So
in school, I had ancient Greek, Latin, French, and German. Now, like the quality of that is going to vary quite a bit. I would not even come close to saying that I speak anything of French. I can understand the written French. I can probably pick up the local newspaper, but much beyond that. Like I said, my father had tried to speak Irish at home to some degree of success. It's something that I picked up later on in life, but I don't know how to read that one at all. Irish phonology is incredibly alien to me, as it is to anyone who's ever tried to spell an Irish name. They don't necessarily really link up all that well.
Well, as someone that's teaching his son to read at the moment, I trying to introduce him to English phonics, and I'm just apologizing to him in advance. Is like, It's not going to remain this simple. It's going to get much harder.
Yeah, but like dissecting English phonics gives you a good idea of exactly the point of origin for so many words. And English, um, this is something that linguists like to argue all the time, is not strictly speaking a Germanic language. About a quarter of our words are of Germanic origin, and
Hmm.
certainly the more popular and grammatical framework is Germanic. But like the influence of Latin and particularly French is pretty apparent to any native speaker.
Yeah. And speaking as someone that is dyslexic, that is not helpful. But as I mentioned earlier, I did pick up Duolingo and complete its Latin course, which, to be fair, isn't that advanced. So once that was finished, I picked up the Spanish and started going through that as well. My Spanish and Latin are nearly of equal score at the moment. So just as somebody that has dived so deeply into languages, do you have any tips for me? How do I get better at languages?
So there really is no royal road to this. There's no shortcut. When it
That's
comes to
not the
living
answer that
language,
I wanted.
yeah, when it comes to living languages, that's a little bit easier. Spanish, certainly, there's no shortage of places to be able to practice Spanish. It's just when it comes to classical language, like you can't go around the corner and start speaking or making allusions to Virgil. People are going to think you're out of your mind. Uh, in trying to be able to really pick up a language, it's not that you need to kind of beat your head over and over with it, but the constant stream of it. It's the same way that children learn it. So if you're doing Duolingo, doing a little bit of it every day, so that there's some level of retention and recall. And I say this on a neurological level as well, because the ability to develop second language skills is tremendous. Having that kind of cognitive reserve is good for your neural health. It staves off things like dementia. It's really one of those things that should be put out there for the public health, but isn't.
Hmm. Well, that's reassuring. I'm not. I'm not going to go crazy just yet. One thing that I've started doing for my Latin is there's an app called Legentibus, and that focuses much more on stories. So I'm hearing stories spoken in simple Latin, and they have simplified versions. They've got the martyrdom of Saint Valentine, for example, but
Yeah.
obviously greatly simplified for my 1 year Latin effectively level.
So I think there's a couple of works out there in terms of beginner's Latin, in terms the Aeneid,
Mm-hmm.
I should say, is usually one of those works that's used. It can be chopped up into smaller bits, but the vocabulary that's used is familiar and repetitive so that you can kind of slowly pick up on exactly what those words are. Because the more familiar you are with them and even how they're declined, uh, the easier it's going to be.
Oh yeah, I don't have the patience to learn tables of declensions. So most of what I have is instinctive. But one other thought that I had, and this was actually a Lewis suggestion. He writes in one of his letters to find a book that you know well in that other language. So I think it was somebody that was learning French. They picked up a copy of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe in French, and he himself read among other versions of the Bible, the Vulgate. So I was toying with the idea of trying to pick up the Psalms each day, but in Latin.
The Vulgate wouldn't be too bad. Now, there's different versions of the Vulgate, too. So there's Jerome's original 5th century Vulgate,
Hmm.
which is certainly very thick, but over the centuries, people have noticed the regular errors. I believe the Holy See put out a new version of the Vulgate in the late 70s to try to address some of the continual concerns. It's one of those projects that seems to reappear every couple of centuries. Like there's the 16 Vulgate in the 17th century, I want to say, where they tried to be able to amend some of the issues of translation in their own time. The issue, of course, even with a dead language, is that if Latin is dead, other languages continue to move along. So how exactly do we understand them then?
Hmm. Well, let's end with a personal question. What has your work in all this translation? What's it done to your faith, or has it shaped it?
I think it's done a lot of things, actually. I think there's a certain teenage and even college age intellectual arrogance that a lot of people can carry themselves with. Once you recognize exactly what you are in the scheme of history, this kind of like this little speck. It's really hard to be able to maintain that kind of state of delusion. So working with some of these tremendous authors of the past, their own sense of achievement, translating the works of kings and emperors, and you have to take it with a tremendous sense of your own humility here. And the recognition that, like, okay, you can be famous and you can do all of these kinds of things, but ultimately there has to be some sense where you recognize the smallness of what you are before God, just as we all do. Just the same as what Thomas Aquinas said towards the tail end of his life. It's all straw. He wrote this masterpiece, the Summa Theologica, which is logistically perfect, working its way step by step through every conceivable item. And to him, it was nothing.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, there has to be some sense of that, even with the tremendous industry that has gone into a project like this, it still has to be taken as an act of piety, an act of devotion. I think in the process of working so thoroughly intellectually on this, I've recognized my own limited sense of knowing how to pray, which is not an intellectual task, but it's still something that's fundamental to our faith.
Wonderful. Nothing but you, Lord. Nothing but you. Well, where can people go to find out more about you and the Scriptorium Project?
So the Scriptorium Project has pretty decent distribution at this point. We are on 40,000 distributors. The biggest one's Amazon, but there's other ones, Kobo, Barnes & Noble, basically anywhere that you would go to buy books. Most texts are available in paperback and in ebook, so we have distribution effectively all over the world. There aren't a lot of people that are buying books in like Timbuktu, but theoretically you could.
Mm-hmm.
We also have a website, www.thescriptoriumproject.com, which has everything cataloged by Eastern and Western Church, and then specific regions. So in the West, the Frankish Church, the medieval German, the Italian, the Anglo-Saxon, the Celtic. Kind of get the picture. All of that is available. All you have to do is go to the site and click on the individual book itself, and it'll take you, I believe, to Amazon.
And if you had to make a recommendation for someone that hasn't read many of these sorts of works before, and so they want to dip their toe in, what might you point them towards?
Oh, that's a good one. I would recommend first going with some of the more familiar ante-Nicene fathers,
Mm-hmm.
and then going into some of these. But for me, as a psychologist, there are two works that I think are really salient in particular. So I think the work by St. Augustine, De Vita Vitae, which is on the happy life,
Mm-hmm.
is really a useful text. It's not heavily philosophical. It's not kind of with these like lofty ideas or let's dialectically dissect all of these words so we understand them better. He wants to understand what it means to be happy and what that looks like in his life, which is straightforward enough. And he lays it out in maybe 40 or 50 pages. So for one of the works of Augustine, which is a man who wrote over 5 million words, that is probably the most accessible. I would start there after Confessions. Don't jump to City of God. That's like reading the phone book. Most people get very frustrated with it very quickly. The other one is an Egyptian saint, Saint Mary of Egypt, who,
lovely.
Yes, her biography by Saint Sophronis of Jerusalem from the 7th century is usually very popular, but it's also very insightful in a way that most hagiographies are not. Again, you have this sense of psychological insight into the person, which is rare in the ancient world and just kind of emerging as we go into the medieval period.
I think those are some great suggestions. Thoroughly recommend both of those. Well, Dermot, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, anytime, David.
And viewers, please join us again next time, and we'll continue going further up and further in. Cheers.